Now, by way of introduction, progress in the dynamics of the exercises. Now, by progress, what do I mean? I mean that you can't move from one section of the exercises into another without incorporating the phase you're leaving into the one you're beginning. In other words, you can't do second week without first week, and first week material colors the way you read the second week. The second week colors the way you read the third week. And as you move along, there is a growth or a development, and then we call that progress. It's a developmental growth towards the finality that is intended in the particular work you're doing. So you're fulfilling whatever that is. What is? It's to be open, as was the Lord Jesus, to the will of the Father in your concrete circumstances of life, as Jesus was in his concrete circumstances of life. So progress in this dynamics, this movement that we've been looking at in the exercises, is through a process of contemplative development. Now, the key word there, we've already described progress in many ways as kind of developmental, but contemplative means it comes through a way of praying in which we appropriate not only the external activity of Jesus in a gospel scene, but his psychological motivation, his spiritual inspiration. What were the possibilities as you pray over a scene that this exposes the mind and heart of Jesus and the grace of Jesus? Okay, psychological and spiritual, and the graces of Jesus. So this contemplative development is also a process. That means that you pray differently as you move through the third week from the way you moved in the second week. And you'll notice that Ignatius himself has far fewer instructions in the third week compared to the second week, and even less in the fourth. As you go on, more and more, you've found your own rhythm as one making the retreat that you know is compatible for you in the way you pray, okay? And a good guide, a companion, the one who gives the exercises, has a sense of how you pray best and allows you to do that and to grow and develop in your own confidence as the Lord leads you. So more and more, the so-called director or the one who gives the retreat recedes in the background and allows the Lord to do what annotation 15 indicated, to be more pervasively in direct communication with the one making the retreat, okay? So it's a loaded description, is what I'm saying, from Ivan's, when he talks about this contemplative development. What this means is understanding the pervasive spiritual environment of grace within the experience of the exercises. It's all gift. It's not something that we energize ourselves to. We said this again and again. It's not a program as much as it is an encounter. It's an experience. It's a meeting of the Lord. Is that the one journeying through the exercises? Why did I use the word journeying? Because it's a kind of pilgrimage. Why is that so important? Because the pilgrimage is an important concept, experience, basic experience, fundamental experience, radical experience in the personal journey of Ignatius. And I think a lot of the ways we come to understand Ignatian spirituality is to accept the pilgrimage mentality that's behind it. And what does it mean? It means that you don't come as a tourist. You get involved. You try to realize that you yourself will be changed by the experience you're making, and the experience will involve a certain amount of journeying that is both moving through something that you can demarcate, you can specify and talk about as moving from first week to second week and so on, but it's also internal. And that journey will not only be progressive, moving towards something, but it's also regressive. It's looking back at where you came from and how that's influenced where you're going. So there's a richness and a density in this Ignatian experience that is both a progressive narrative, a narrative that moves ahead, but it's also a regressive, not in the sense of falling backwards, but in the sense of retrospective, looking back on how you got there. What Ignatius laconically talks about as the beginning, the middle, and the end. There's a rich meaning in that, okay? So it's the journeying through the exercises and the one guiding him or her. Now this is what's important. Both move in ways that deepen and widen the relationship with Jesus as the Christ and as the Lord. Now let's unpack that a little bit. When I use the word deepen, what I mean is you become more internally compatible with who Christ is revealing himself to be, so that the word that Ignatius uses so often, desire, you realize more and more is something that is both originating within your own life, but touched by the expectation and the invitation that Jesus has in prayer for you. You know, it's like, I desire an ice cream cone. Let's take a little silly example. Or you say, I feel like eating an ice cream cone because it's cold and it's sweet and it tastes good and it's invigorating for me. And I desire that. Well, so does the person selling the ice cream. That's why they have different colors, different flavors, kind of an ambiance that invites you. They're desiring you to buy what they're selling. And so every time you purchase something, there's a mutual desire being fulfilled. That's a human experience. God builds on that natural human experience in the experience of grace. What we desire is frequently what God desires. Why do I say frequently? Because we can desire things that take us away from God. But we are moving towards something that is genuinely consoling, towards something that involves greater faith or hope or love or confidence or self-giving, donation, care, a more universal view. These are all life-giving movements towards God. When we are becoming fearful, unhealthily inward-looking, morbid, obsessive about our conduct or about how we're moving, suspicious, and anger that separates us from others. These are all actions away from God, desolations. So notice, well, they're all this part of this desire. So deepening means as you have been moving through the exercises, you see that you are growing and developing in your own spiritual autonomy, the way you can pray knowing that this is how God calls you, and that as you're doing this, you are more and more in touch with what your real desires are, and you acknowledge these as an ongoing mutuality. Say, and that's what God wishes for me too. And that is one of the most beautiful moments of consolation, when you say, I am happy, and God is happy with me. Remember the movie, this one, about the English runners during the Olympics, Chariots of Fire, when the young man who's a Methodist minister tries to explain to his sister why he doesn't feel training on the Sabbath is in any way alienating him from God. He says, when I run, I feel his pleasure. And when I said, when hearing that movie, watching, I kept saying, that's what consolation is. I feel the pleasure of God, the pleasure of God. All right, that's deepen. And widen the relationship means not only do I deepen it, but I begin to see the ripple effect of God's grace is that it involves other things and other people. I'm finding God in all things, in other words. I'm finding that the relationship with God does not isolate me from life, but it, as it were, multiplies my spiritual antennae to reach out to all the ways in which God is present in the world around me. So now, as you as a director or guide or one who gives the exercises deal with the person, you will notice as you enter the third week of the exercises that without your spelling all this out, these kinds of things are happening with the woman or man you're guiding. They begin to have a more capacious, a wider understanding of how God works, a greater understanding that prayer can happen not only in times of formal prayer, but in formal moments when I'm eating, sleeping, showering, walking, looking at nature, thinking about my life. I suddenly realize that God is part of all the life that I have been living, and there's a vitality that comes with this. Okay, why is it vital? Because it so enhances what it is for me to be human. And you wind this relationship with Jesus as the Christ and the Lord. That's the very first number in the exercises. Okay. Jesus as the Christ, it is the fulfillment of the expectation of the chosen people, the anointed one, the Messiah. And the Lord is kurios, the phrase that the early Christian community used subtly at first and gradually more explicitly to see in Jesus not only the fulfillment of the Old Testament expectation, but of the presence of God's very self in their midst in the presence of Jesus. So these have both these meanings. Now, notice what I've been saying. That is, in weeks 2 and 3, the crucified and risen Lord opens himself both to the one who makes the exercises, the retreatant, and to the one who gives them as the Lord who confronts sin through mercy and also invites others to accompany him in the labor of the kingdom. We want to underscore here as you move on into the third week, it's very important to see both the one who makes the retreat and the one who gives the retreat are going to be involved more and more in the graces of the exercises. As a director, you should never look on the one making the exercises as the one who gets the grace of the exercises. As a guide or a director, you're getting all those graces over and over and over again. It's a ministry. It's a ministry. You are being formed as you are an instrument of formation. And therefore, God is illuminating you, accompanying you, and helping you to help someone else. And generally, in doing that, God is helping you to be a helper, helping you to be attentive, to be sensitive, to understand, and to see. And so you go back to the very first number in the exercises when Ignatius, in enunciating the title, says, exercise to help both the one who makes and the one who gives the spiritual exercises. And therefore, when you reflect, you're not only reflecting objectively on the person who's been there and dealing with his or her prayer, but intersubjectively, the way you are relating, and then subjectively, what's been happening to you. That you come to new insights, you come to new understanding. Things challenge you, that you realize what you have been saying. You'd say, maybe I haven't been living this myself, but it sounds good. Maybe I ought to look at that, huh? All that kind of thing. All right. The retreatant gratitude for being both a sinner redeemed and called to discipleship gradually morphs. It takes on the form of a deeper relationship with the Lord, what Ivans calls as contemplative development. So the one giving the exercises grows in wisdom, for example, the ability to see the reality of life in terms of the presence of God. Charity, the ability to love with something of the dynamism of God's love. And self-understanding, that is, that possession of who I am before God in a way that marks me as the creature who has been beloved and called, something like that, through these same sets of contemplative experiences. Okay? All right? So the one giving and the one making are really more and more drawn into a shared graced experience, and you realize that as you move. Now, this deeper relationship with the Lord, with Jesus, is friendship. And I put then, it's the posture of the beloved disciple in John's gospel who sees and believes. Those are the two characteristics of the beloved disciple. Now, remember that the beloved disciple appears in John's gospel at the Last Supper, leaning on the breast of Jesus. Then he appears as the emissary for Peter, taking him into the courtyard of the high priest. And then he appears under the cross as the beloved disciple to whom Jesus gives his mother. And finally, you see the beloved disciple at the moment of the resurrection running with Peter to the tomb and seeing and believing, okay? And then the beloved disciple in John 21, in the epilogue of John's gospel, is the disciple that recognizes the Lord, and all the disciples rush to the seashore, led by Peter. And then he's the one about whom Jesus says to Peter, don't you ask any questions about him. Let him take care of himself. You just do what I tell you, the beloved disciple. Well, that beloved disciple is an enigmatic figure. For sometimes there was a tendency to melt him into John the Evangelist or to John the Apostle. But it really seems more and more, especially through the work of Father Ray Brown, that the beloved disciple is a distinct personality who embodies what it is to be a true, intuitive believer in Jesus. Not somebody who has to have all the data in front of him or her, but who sees it as being connatural to the way God is working in her or his life. Okay, so let's pursue that a little bit. It is this effective insight into the heart of the Lord that the beloved disciple's ability to see into that constitutes the grace desired in week 2 of the exercises. That inner knowledge of the Lord who became human for me so that I might better love and follow him. Now, the operative word that we come back to again and again is became human for me. You cannot make the exercises if you bracket the human. And that's going to be especially true in the 3rd week of the exercises. And as we will see, Ignatius underscores that by talking about, see how the divinity hides itself. In other words, see how the humanity is the reality that bears the revelation of Jesus in the passion and death. Okay. There's no divine action that separates Jesus from suffering and death. But there's only the human reality that immerses him into suffering and death. There's more we want to say about that, but so in the light of this beloved discipleship relationship, the one making the exercises has accepted the particular ways that he or she has been led to follow the crucified and the risen Lord through the election that we talked about last month and a deepening of a call already made, or in the reformation of a call not lived well, or in the acceptance of a new life direction. 3 ways in which the election can manifest itself. Remember, we took that last week. On the significance of this relationship, I have a quote there from Ray Brown. Peter, among the 12, is the spokesman in addressing Jesus. But at the Last Supper in John, Simon Peter cannot directly speak to Jesus, for he is at a distance from him. Remember, all John is so symbolically overlaid that when Peter can't talk to the Lord at the Last Supper, that's not just talking about table placement. It's talking about his inability to understand what's going on. Okay. Well, who understands that? The one leaning on the breast of Jesus. Rather, Peter must speak to Jesus through the intermediary of the beloved disciple who is closest to Jesus, reclining on Jesus' breast. Okay. Remember, all through the exercises, we've talked about the importance of colloquy. What is colloquy? It's reclining on the breast of the Lord. So it's very scriptural. So the more and more the colloquy characterizes the prayer of one making the exercise, the more and more that woman or man is moving into the posture of the beloved disciple. In the synoptic tradition, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, Peter is the only one of the 12 to follow the arrested Jesus into the court or palace of the high priest. But in John, in chapter 18, it's different. Simon Peter cannot follow Jesus into the courtyard until the disciple arranges for admittance. You know, see that theme coming up again and again? So now what is Peter, what's being said in John? Something's being said about the church. The church needs the leadership of Peter, but the leadership of Peter has its limits. The church only comes to life with the leadership of the beloved disciple, which is intuitive, spiritual. Okay. All right. Anyway, we'll say more about that. In the synoptic tradition, even Peter ultimately abandons Jesus so that no follower of Jesus stands close by as he dies on the cross. Okay. But in John, one male follower never abandons Jesus. For at the foot of the cross stands the beloved disciple as well as the mother of Jesus. Indeed, by making his mother the mother of the beloved disciple, which is done in John, Jesus is adopting the disciple as his brother. Thus, the scene at the cross supplies the Johannine answer to the traditional question that you find in synoptics: who are my mother and my brothers? That Jesus asks. Remember, in Mark, it's a repudiation. In Matthew, it's softened. In Luke, it's Jesus answers and says, "It's my mother and my brothers are the hearers of the word." They've developed in discipleship by the time you come to Luke's gospel. But in John's gospel, Brown is saying, what you have here is a dramatic presentation that the disciple who stands beneath the cross is really the brother or sister of Jesus. Okay. Now, why do I spend so much time on this? Because this is the particular exegetical stance that St. Ignatius takes in the exercises. We are asked to have an intuitive understanding of the sufferings of Jesus in his humanity as being a window of understanding the divine suffering. And that's a daring possibility. Can God suffer? We say, well, God is immutable. So we have to protect that, don't we? I say, oh, we have to protect the theology. But do you know of any father whose heart would not break at seeing the death of his son? And remember how important I told all of us at the beginning it is to keep Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, in mind. What kind of father was that? What kind of father? The Abba presence of the Father to Jesus is very important. And so God the Father suffers in the suffering of his Son in a way we do not understand, but we cannot repudiate. To say, but we have to define impassibility, the impossibility of God's suffering. And I always say, why? If you think of it as an imperfection, yes. But if you think of the ability to feel passionately the agony of those you love as a virtue, it's a whole new way of thinking of how God is present. How did the church get by all this for so many centuries? How do we handle the tenderness and vulnerability of God? Anybody? Mary. Mary. The sorrowful mother. Never said the sorrowful father. So we attributed in the history of the church much of the divine pity to Mary, because it gave us a theological safety net. So you're going to find more and more theologians venturing in this idea of the passibility of God, that God suffers with his Son. They say, well, I don't understand it. I said, no, but it's easier for me to explain that and believe it than it is for me to explain God has to protect God's impassibility. I don't. It's like people go crazy when they say, you know, they desecrated the host. And I said, I don't think you can hurt Jesus. I think you have nutty people out there doing crazy things, but he's not yielding himself to them. The Eucharist is a relationship. It's not a materiality. Christ does not relate to people who hate him. Why? Because he can't love back when they're not loving him. They've cut themselves off from love. So all this nutty theology about, well, we don't want to hurt Jesus, or people running into a burning church to save the Eucharist, heroic act, bad theology. It can't hurt Jesus. Okay? Not anymore. But does Jesus feel for us? Yes, yes, but not in a way that's injurious, but a way that's enriching. Have you ever fallen in love? Like, oh, but he has. But you had to give up the love. We just know nothing you can do about it, okay? You would never, ever say, I wish I hadn't fallen in love, even though it hurts. Because it's too good an experience. Too deep, too rich, too humanizing. And you say, how can I feel so deeply, deeply blessed by what has hurt me so much? That's when you love. When you see the blessing in the sorrow you bear, because there's nothing else you can do with it. You can't make that other person hateful, because then you can bear it better. You can only love them. And that's what you have to keep, a Christian has to keep doing that all the time. Anybody serious about her or his religion. Okay. So the interior dynamic of the exercises leading up to and into week 3, which begins at Bethany, as Jesus sends the disciples to prepare the Last Supper meal, and ends on Calvary, the burial. And notice in Mary's withdrawal, Ignatius talks about. Mary withdraws to her home as one of the last activities of week 3. Why? Because she's going to be one of the first activities of week 4 for Ignatius. The risen Lord appears to her. Okay? The Ignatian distribution of the exercises in week 3 is pretty straightforward, leading to what has sometimes been called Passion Day, number 208, when Ignatius invites at the end of the process, say, let the one making the exercises get a day away from you as a guide, and just spend the day as he or she wishes with the Passion, It's a nice day. The 7th day of week 3. There is a complexity within week 3, which centers on the Ignatian meaning of compassion and the Ignatian meaning of confirmation. They're affective states of loving in the Lord who is abandoned, humiliated, and rejected. And that's important. So what's meant by confirmation in week 3 of the exercises? Compassion, and this is quoting Ivans, consists in a certain spiritual empathy. Now, they're all weasel words there, aren't they? Certain. You'd say, well, certain is okay, but it doesn't tell me what. I said, why is that weasel word there? Ivans is a very careful writer. Why? It's there because it's going to be different in every person. And so you as a director are praying for the ability to have insight into the way the one you are helping is being moved, so that you can reverence and respect that, not so you can manipulate it or change it, but so that you can be responsive to it. It's always going to be different. Huh? Some people will have no words. They just feel very moved, and they're moved to tears. Some people say, I don't feel that, but I think I understand it. And they don't mean the way they understand a text. They mean the way they have an insight into a person. But they're different ways. So that's why he uses that word certain. Certain. It's something specific, but it's different from woman to man and man to woman and person to person, an older person, younger person, okay? Spiritual empathy. Empathy is an entering into the sorrow or suffering of another. What's important about that? Empathy is not psychological losing of your identity. That's pathological. Okay? You never not are you, but you have such a close identification that you feel this with the person. And sometimes people will say, I recently had a friend whose sister died. Oh, it's Margaret Brennan's niece. And Margaret Brennan said, I wish I could die for her. My life is finished. But she still has 20 years. I just asked God to take me instead of her. That's empathy. Margaret Brennan didn't commit suicide, but she entered into the suffering of her niece and understood what it was for the niece to leave her husband and her children and prematurely die of cancer. She understood that. That's empathy. So, consists in a certain spiritual empathy such that the contemplation is itself a passion for the one contemplating, a suffering which is ours, but in and through which Christ makes us sharers of his own suffering. It can exist only as a mode of intense love. It transforms one's perceptions of every meaning of the passion and the quality of every response to it. And it is the key to that contemplative union and action by which, through the apostles, Christ continues to labor and suffer in the mission of the church in the world. It's a great paragraph. Great paragraph. What would I put in contrast? I want to be very careful here because I know this is a film that's helped many people. Mel Gibson's film on the Passion it's moved people intensely, but it really does emphasize the physicality of the suffering of Jesus. That physicality mirrors something inside, psychologically. I'm not denying that at all. But my instinct would be that Ignatius would not be too quick to say we should see Mel Gibson's Passion during the third week, because I think it would put an emphasis on the physical suffering and not on the idea of the love that inspires that physical suffering. Christ is not a victim. Okay? He is victimized. But the assertion throughout the Passion is always that this is what I am doing because I have been asked to do it. He never becomes like the enemy. And that's why all those acts of forgiveness tumble out during the Passion. They are the profound assertion that the enemy has not won my soul. Remember in John's Gospel when Pilate holds Jesus up in the courtyard and he says, Ecce homo, this is the man. That's a deep theological statement. This is what it is to be human. It's not to hate, but it's to love. It's not to be vindictive, but to forgive. It's not to weep and cry and pray aloud that these people will be good to you. It's to remind them that what they're doing is unjust, but they cannot cripple the moral integrity with which you move through your own death. So does Christ feel all that? Does he feel isolation, rejection, marginalization? Yes, that's the human reality. But part of the human reality is also, he also retains the inner dignity of his own self-acceptance and especially his trust that somehow through this, the Father will vindicate him and the meaning of mercy and love will be revealed. Taking the most ignominious cultural sign of degradation in the world that Jesus knew, which was the Roman cross. No Roman citizen was to be crucified. Jesus has transformed it into a symbol of love. Because on it, he forgave. On it, he loved. On it, he accepted. And what you try to help a person in the third week of the exercises understand is that's precisely why we love him. You don't have to say Jesus suffered more than any other person who ever lived. We don't know that. Sometimes there have been rhetorical exaggerations of that ilk. but it's saying more than the data gives us. All we have to say is that culturally it was an ignominious death. It was a death reserved for those who had rebelled against Rome. It was meant to teach a lesson of subjection to a conquered people. It was hideous, and yet he entered into it. But so, too, there are many other hideous deaths, humiliating experiences. And the whole tissue of the passion and death of Jesus really has been implanted and taken on new flesh throughout Christian life and all other kinds of people. Their agony in the garden, their stripping of their dignity, their false judgments, the heavy burden of their cross, the feeling that they are alone and alienated, looking for a companion and they found none, and finally dying even in the sense that God doesn't seem to care. Our modern, from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, to poor people dying of malnutrition, there's that litany in which the cross is being recapitulated. And that's what we said before about the deepening and the widening that takes place, seeing the cross in other places. Now, what is meant in the third week by this process of confirmation? Throughout the exercises, the reality of the cross has constantly been a reference point. The cross testifies to the depth of God's love through the donation of his Son, number 53 in the first week of the exercises. It's interpreted as a reconciliation of the seriousness of sin and the greater testimony of grace. The ultimate proof of how intensely and fully Jesus entered into our own humanity as a companion in our suffering. Now, the dramatic tableau of the gospel narratives are laid out as confirmation of all this sustained love, mercy, reconciliation, and especially of the intimate union of Jesus that Jesus has with us in our humanity, even unto death and burial. So, at the moment of the test, lead us not into temptation, lead us not into the test. What is the test for Jesus? To abandon humanity. I want you to think of that because on your own, I've given you 2 chapters from Michael Himes that really, to me, very simply but profoundly open up the meaning of Philippians 2, 1-11, that kenosis, the emptying of Jesus, is what? It's a recapitulation of the sin of Adam and Eve being redone by him. Adam and Eve were not satisfied with being human. They wanted to be like God. Christ relinquished all the paraphernalia of divinity that others attributed to it and plunged into the reality of the human. That is what saved us. And the test of the passion and death of Jesus is at the ultimate moment in which the divinity could cry out and say, enough. Jesus says, no, it is finished. Into your hands I commit my spirit. There's no relinquishment of the human. Okay? There's where humanism lies. It's education under the sign of the cross. It's culture under the sign of the cross. Not in any morbid way, but in a way that having come to the moment of intense choice, Jesus chooses to stand ultimately with the human. There's no opting out. Well, isn't the resurrection an opting out? No, it's a fulfillment of what it is to be human. We are called to be what? With God as images of God. We'll see that next month. Next month. Now Jesus invites the man or woman making the exercises to share in a covenant confirmation symbolized by the election that they made. They placed it in Christ's hands at the close of week 2. Richer still is the implication that how I prayed, how I have found the meaning of Christ and it's my way to God, the history that has borne me to this point in my life with God, the realities that the exercises has embraced are now confirmed, and they're bringing me into a companionship with the Lord more deeply. That's the confirmation. Everything I've done has had a meaning, and the meaning is to be found in my companionship with Jesus, who embraces what it is to be human, even into death and burial. Okay? My retreat experience has opened me to an understanding that the sacrifice of Jesus is personal for me and for the world, of which I am part. Finally, there's a dimension of confirmation that moves into the working out in time and space of what is wanting in the sufferings of Christ through those who, throughout Christian history, continue the passion and death. That can frequently be a movement that people have in the third week of the exercises. Carol Houselander's This War is the Passion. A great little Christian classic. There is a richness in week 3 that transcends the Ignatian text. In our scriptural scholarship about the passion and death of Jesus, the more we know about it. For example, Ray Brown's work in The Death of the Messiah. Another enrichment of the exercises is to be found in our understanding of human suffering. John Paul II's 1984 apostolic letter, Salvifici Dolores, Christian Meaning of Human Suffering, and Miller's book, Facing Human Suffering. Those are just examples. And in The Challenge of Social Justice and Solidarity, Dean Brackley's book, The Call to Discernment in Troubled Times. These theological, psychological, and social realities that have enriched our human understanding should help us to appreciate the still evolving ways that confirmation can be understood in the third week of the exercises. Okay? They help us. Okay? So that the more we, as guides, directors, companions, enrich ourselves psychologically, theologically, I would say on a literary level, the more we enhance our understanding of the role of suffering and the mystery of suffering in life, and the more we tie that into what Ignatius presents as the divinity hiding itself, meaning the more that the humanity of Jesus becomes the prominent reality of the third week, that we begin to grasp Philippians 2:1-11, which we will hear again and again and again during the week we call Holy. Finally, I put it here, a key hermeneutic within the Ignatian text is found in that 196, on the divinity hiding itself in the passion and death. And in that sense, and I gave you Heims's pages, which are very rich, but easy enough to read. But they bring out the whole idea of what Jesus was accomplishing could only be accomplished if he entered with us genuinely into passion and death, which is ours as well. Okay. So any reflection, question, observation? Tony, why don't you bring your question up?
Yeah, the part about how it becomes the confirmation, coming off of the first insight that I find very helpful, that he does not opt out of the human, but stays with the human all the way through to the accepting death, because that's what it is to be human, is to die, and he does that. And that is kind of that first move there, and that is confirming of the human. And then the other point you were making is that, and to see that as being confirmed in all the other ways of suffering, that kind of solidarity with all the other kind of suffering. Could you work that over a little more?
If Jesus is the new Adam, as Paul talks about Christ being the new Adam, I mean, in some ways he starts a new way of being human before God, then people who follow him explicitly or implicitly, they're compatriots either by their profession or by the quality of their lives. Those people are really part of the mystical body of Christ. They include the activity of Jesus and what they're doing. And so in prayer, a woman or man could say, well, I was moved today by understanding how the passion continues in the life of good people who suffer for what they believe in, what they think is true, what they think is beautiful. And they're not always Christian, and they're not even always people who believe in God, but they're willing to be humiliated and fight for what they believe and suffer, but they never become like the enemy. And they start tumbling out all these characteristics that are part of a groups of people that I would really say are Christ-like in the radical sense of being loving and forgiving and yet never abandoning their ideals or their values. And the world is populated with people we forget about sometimes, in whom the passion and death of Jesus are being recapitulated. So what I wanted to say and try to get across is, once you open up the possibility of what confirmation means, you save it from the reductionism that, well, the third week is really about keeping your retreat resolution, called election. And therefore, it's building up moral stamina so that after this retreat, you'll want to be with the crucified Christ and not eat candy bars anymore, or whatever, you know. Well, you say, well, you want to be careful that the confirmation is about a process whereby you become the beloved disciple of the Lord, and you become sister or brother to Jesus before the Father. There's something in there, I think. It's very important. That's really the radical election is I name and judge my humanity by what Christ has revealed it is to be human. And where there are strains or there are things I find difficult, like poor spirit, humility, laying down your life for another, forgiving your enemy, these are all hard moments if they're taken in isolation from being with Jesus. And that's what we do sometimes. But I think when you unify it with Jesus, you say that the radical election is to read my humanity in terms of being with and through the figure of Jesus, what he reveals. Then in turn, because it's mutual, my own humanity enriches what I understand the humanity of Jesus is. It's very spousal. If you think that if in a marriage that works, every day the wife is teaching the husband how to be a husband and the husband's teaching the wife how to be a wife, it's spousal. And that doesn't mean in good times only, in bad times, that they're teaching them what the reality is. And through acceptance and forgiveness and growth, they come. It's the same thing in a religious community. Vow day, you're a young guy, you take your vows and you say, I really want to live this life. Then you begin to realize in the tedium that the people you live with are not the people you would always choose to live with. They're the people that are in the community. So community life can be difficult because it's not freely chosen. It's a process I freely choose, but not a contextualized reality that I freely chose. And then the work I do, I freely chosen to do this work, but it's not always easy. Something happens and you get embarrassed, but you are part of the organization and you feel the burden of that embarrassment. What I'm saying is the working out of any relationship which is mutual is always going to be enriching, but at the same time it's going to be a burden, going to be a cross in some way or the other. Otherwise it's not mutual. If you say, I love my kids as long as they're clean, neat, and orderly, and they always do what I tell them, well, they're not going to be like that. They're going to be people. And you can't withdraw love because they don't perform the way you want. Love is not performance. It's accepting the reality in process as it revolves. So I think that as you pray over it, you see the third week in a richness of confirmation that really pushes you sometimes to why poetry is so important is not because it's pretty words, because it pushes us to how many things in life are related, and we don't really know the ultimate mystery to explain the relationship, but we know we can't live without it. We need it. We need it. We need air. We need light. We need other people. We need these things. Okay? And yet, everything we touch, the air can be too cold, the light can be too bright, the light can't be bright enough. Every reality that we need is imperfect. It just is. That's what it is to live in an imperfect, evolving world of which we are part. Okay? And the radical acceptance of that brings one to peace. Okay? You don't expect more than you can get, and you rejoice in what you have. I'm just reading Dorothy Day's diaries, and in her diary, I'm always amazed that she loved little things, like sitting in the sun at a part of the day was important for her, or people bringing her a candy bar or an ice cream cone, or somebody coming in and cleaning. Yet, along with it, all the things that she was dealing with people that weren't always clean hygienically, who were not always grateful for what they got, who could get into fights easily. And yet she said that's what Friendship House is. It's accepting in hospitality the people no one else would accept. And there's good reason why they don't accept them. They're not always, they don't smell nice, act nice, and they aren't nice. But they're the people God brings in. And there's a reality there, okay? So the third week, richness of confirmation, is you don't want people to slip into saying, I'm making the third week so that I can really keep my resolution. I said, well, it's a good resolution and it's life-giving. You should want to do it because it's life-giving and it's because something that's pointed to you the direction that you want your life to go in terms of reform, in terms of a deepening of appreciation for how you've been called, or a whole new life pattern that you hadn't thought about. Those are the three areas, okay? But confirmation is not just that, it's a richer understanding of a whole set of realities that are part of the exercises. Okay. Any other question? Paul?
Howard, do you interpret Jesus' cry, my God, why have you forsaken me, as part of that revelation of being human?
That's very good. Yeah, I do. And more exegetes will say, especially when you have Mark's gospel, all the way through the Gospels, Jesus is talking about the Father. But at the end, he talks about God. And some would say the intimation is that the consolation of knowing God as Father has been taken away. But the faith that God is present is not taken away. So at the end, there is the sense of that abandonment of familiarity, but not of presence. And so that psalm that he quotes, 22nd Psalm, is very appropriate. It's a psalm of torment. And so some exegetes would say, more and more, we should not be afraid to see the crucified Lord, especially find that in Mark. John's crucifixion is different. I mean, beloved disciple, all the things I've said I think are very helpful and good. But remember, you have a triumphant Jesus in John's gospel. The divinity is always showing itself in John's gospel through Jesus. It's symbolic. He knows everything. For myself, you don't have to do anything. I've found that I use one gospel generally in the retreat, and that's Luke's gospel in a 30-day retreat, because it allows you to use everything from the infancy to the entombment, and then the risen Lord, and you have a companionship and compatibility in the text that you can use. And you can tell people when they want to repeat a retreat for an 8-day retreat, try Mark one year and try Matthew. But the richness is that you don't keep jarring text by taking a text out of context and using it for the exercises. You develop a theology that fits into the exercises. But that's another whole question. Anything else about this? of the gap.
Howard, let's go back to the victim. Jesus is not a victim. Now, I forget which Eucharistic prayer it is. We say he's a victim. So just would you go back over that? Because I think that's got a lot of implications for social issues and social justice questions. People, how we deal with people who are victimized, how we who are the do-gooders deal with them. If we know Jesus better in this way, it might help us not to reinforce in society something that ends up being, in the name of justice, really having almost edges of violence or whatever.
Very good question. Let's use another example. One of the syndromes in the battered woman is the battered woman begins to take the blame for her own being battered. She deserved it. She wasn't doing what she should have done. She shouldn't have made the spouse shouldn't have made him mad. She did something wrong. And that's part of she becomes the victim. That is, she says, I deserve what's happening to me. Okay? Now, people can victimize us. They can treat us that way, but there should be an internal dignity and truthfulness in which you say, I don't deserve that. That's all. I realize I can't do much about it, but I'm not going to become like the enemy just because the enemy is total enemy to me. I'm not going to I told you my friend, the Cambodian, who said the greatest thing he wanted to give his kids was to teach them not to hate. Because if they hate, the enemy has won their soul, you know? So the victim is one who has given up their dignity and their hope and their own freedom to become what the victimizers want that person to become. It's scapegoating, you know? And after a while, if people keep telling you you're dumb and you're victimized by teachers who have no heart, and they keep telling some poor kid that is having trouble reading and nobody has diagnosed that what's wrong, they keep saying, well, you're just slow, you're dumb. And after a while, you say, you're not dumb and you're not slow. You have a reading problem, but that can be corrected. And that's de-victimizing this person from something that's victimized him by reading. So if you take examples of the battered wife or the dyslexic child, or you take the example of a particular race or a subjected people, or you take the untouchables in India, until they began to say, we are not victims, and we're not identified as being somehow castigated by birth of being inferior. Somebody has done this to us, and we reject that stigma. We are a human being. We have dignity. That's the point of liberation, that it was really assertion of the human. That's what Jesus died for the human. Do you see what I mean? And I think that the language we have in the liturgy can be very misleading when it talks about Jesus the victim, if by that you mean, if I become the doormat of life for people, somehow I'm holier. I said, no, you're just the doormat for life. It has nothing to do with your being holy. Holiness is touching your dignity, your freedom, and the destiny God gives you, and fulfilling that with the light that God gives you. And that's the whole movement of liberation. Whenever you hear these words, they don't know their place, or somebody's getting uppity, you know that you're living in a society that's built on victimization. And that's why I think it's a bad word, in many ways for me. So that's why I would want to say Christ is victimized, but he's not the victim. He does not become what they want him to be, the outsider, the repudiated. In one sense, he is. There's no sense about it. But that's not, and you see assertions of that dignity throughout the passion and death. And the disciple and the evangelists catch that. I like Luke's, this day you will be with me in paradise. That's authority, power, compassion, all together. this day you will be with me in paradise. I have the power to say this. Now, did Jesus really say that, or was this the gospel? Well, probably was the gospel being rewritten. We have very small core of what we can say ipsissima verba Jesu, huh? But it's the spirit in which the early church understood him. That's not the language of a victim. That's good, excellent question. And you need an example like the battered wife is a good one. The kid that can't read well because he has a problem or she has a problem, that's a good one. Or a whole people socially stigmatized as being inferior only because somebody decided they were. And they perpetuated that tradition, what the Nazis did to the Jews. And the whole program was to destroy Jewish culture, books, music, homes. All that was destroyed, taken away.
Hopefully this is on topic.
Sure, everything is.
You have in your notes here that the dramatic tableaus of the gospel narratives are laid out as confirmation of all the sustained love, mercy, and reconciliation. And I can go back to the Passion of the Christ. All the discussion at the time it came out seemed to be around the fact that all the physical violence was there as a measure of how much God loved us, how much pain he could endure, how much pain Jesus endured was a measure of how much love he had. Would you react to that?
Well, I haven't seen the film.
No, but just that principle, that the more pain that he felt, the greater love that we can be assured that.
I think that's a very bad theological and ascetical principle, because it slips into the harder is the better. You know, well, the more you suffer, the better it is, right? Wrong. It's just the more you love, the better. Can love be proved by doing things that you ordinarily would not do, but you do it for the person you love and care for? Of course, of course. But if you came up to a parent who was taking care of a sick child, or taking care of a spouse who no longer could take care of themselves, and I'm sure there are trying moments. I don't want to pretend it's all beautiful, but there are moments in which they say, "But you know, it's love. It's love." And of course, I feel the inconvenience. I wish I could do this. But when you love something, this is what it is to love. This is why you do it, you know. I used to find, I still do, I would find that correcting papers of the students that simply didn't get it, I always found terribly hard. Because you didn't even say, oh. And so the temptation would be, don't waste your time on something that's as dumb as this. And then you go out and you get a cup of coffee and say, no, that kid has the right to as much care and concern as the bright kid that makes you feel, oh, I really triumphed. This kid really understands. And you say, well, this kid would understand anybody. Then you go back together and you say, then the task is to find something that's going to help this kid understand what he or she did that's right, and they can do it more pervasively than they've done it. You know, and I would say, it sounds like a little thing, but honestly, I found that always hard to say that if I really love these people, then they deserve attention, and they deserve this kind of little threadbare redemptive act that I have of trying to find something I could say is good in a paper which is basically stinko, you know. And then I'll say, you got it right here. Now, if you develop that, you can, you know. So I don't want you to flunk because I'd have to face you again next year. No, you never say that. But what I'm trying to say is that there are so many instances in which dedication to the integrity of what we have promised really is doing the hard thing. But you're not doing it because it's hard. You're doing it because it's truthful, right, part of the profession, you know. I always say, if you want to do a hard thing, walk on your hands. I just, and there's been so much asceticism that's been presented as the harder thing is pleasing to God because it's harder. I said, think of what you say when you say that God gets God's jollies by watching us be unhappy. I don't believe that. I would find it very hard, personally, I find it hard to serve that way. I'd have to go against everything as a human being I've learned, you know. I don't think that's what God is like at all. I think God companions in my weakness and so on, you know. We are such creatures of our nurturing, our history, you know. It's a little thing, my mother's mother, I've gone back more and more and more, so has my sister, to her and to my mother, because they both had very tough things in their life, and they didn't pretend they weren't tough. It's just they didn't become obsessed by the hardness, but they pushed on through to the gladness that they found. Not by, and how can I say it? Not by denying things that were wrong, but they said, but I'm not going to fixate on it. It doesn't go anywhere. So you need somebody in every group that brings the playfulness out of a group. You just do. Because they remind them that, you know, that's a big part of being human. Okay. All right, Bill, sure.
You talked about the need in week 3 to understand fully Christ's humanity, and you talked about, of course, how he didn't opt out of his humanity when he was crucified. You also mentioned that he said he never said enough. I'm opting out. I don't want any more. This may be an unanswerable kind of a question, but what does that say for his knowledge of his divinity? And if he was fully aware that he was divine and could opt out at any time, how does that affect his humanity?
Okay. What do I believe? I said, I think the theological exposition of levels of consciousness, that gradually Jesus was becoming aware of what it was to be called. Now, what about this thing about infused knowledge? All the knowledge of the world had to be. Do I think that Jesus knew Plato and Socrates? Well, he doesn't give any evidence of it, you know, unless he mumbled to it all to himself at night when nobody was around. I don't believe that. I just don't. I think that what we've done is to impose these. We're always protecting the divinity from not being too human. That's what it means. See? And I said, well, more and more, though, we're seeing the divinity as being very human in many ways, and saying that we, as human, are in the image and likeness of God. That's what I think is the mystery. I don't understand that. How am I the image of the divine? Does God get rashes? Does God get sinus? Does God get hemorrhoids? Or that wonderful book, Does God Have a Big Toe? You know, I think those are questions that, no, that's not what you mean. Being human is, part of it is the physicality, of course it is, a big part. But the human is the spirit that animates the flesh and the psyche to do the things that a free person can do. And that's why I think when you get finding about how we're in the image of likeness of God, it's the freedom we have to love and to be a loving person. That's the great core of the imaging of God. The freedom to love, and out of love to create, and out of creation to care, and out of care to be hurt, and out of hurt to feel, and out of feeling to redeem. That's what my God is. Okay, that's it. Thank you.